Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar, Sweet Science, Demystifying the Impact of Low and No-Calorie Sweeteners on Gut Health, Cravings, and Cancer Risk. I'm Leslie Samay, Director of Professional Development at Great Valley Publishing, and I'm your host for today's show. Before we get started, I have a few points of housekeeping. First, in order to claim your CPE credit, you'll have to remain with us through the entire hour-long presentation. Second, if you have a question, please use the comments box on the left-hand side of your screen to send your question to us. We'll try to address as many questions as time allows. Finally, Sweet Science, Demystifying the Impact of Low and No-Calorie Sweeteners on Gut Health, Cravings, and Cancer Risk awards 1 CPEU in accordance with the Commission on Dietetic Registration's CPEU Prior Approval Program. And now on to our disclosures. Nicole Andrews, RDN, has the following relevant disclosure to report. She is a consultant to Heartland Food Products Group, maker of Splenda brand products. Davide Riso, MSc, PhD, has the following relevant disclosure to report. He is employed by Tate & Lyle, PLC. And Tyler Townsend, MS, RDN, LDN, has the following relevant disclosure to report. He is employed by Heartland Food Products Group, maker of Splenda brand products. Funding from non-CPE revenue for CPE planning, development, review, and/or presentation has been provided by Heartland Food Products Group. And now I'm pleased to introduce today's speakers, Nicole Andrews, Davide Riso, and Tyler Townsend. Nicole is also known as the oncology dietitian and is considered one of the most influential cancer dietitian specialists internationally. As a practicing cancer dietitian and nutritionist for over 12 years, serving the adult and pediatric cancer survivors group during and after cancer treatment, Nicole is passionate about empowering survivors to take control back through nutrition and lifestyle from the inside out. Davide Riso is head of nutrition research at Tate & Lyle PLC, where he leads preclinical, clinical, and observational research in nutrition and public health topics. His 10-plus years of research experience in academia, government, and food industry includes appointments at the National Institutes of Health, the University of Washington, the German Institute of Human Nutrition, and the Ferrero Group. Davide has authored more than 35 scientific publications in international magazines and has presented at numerous conferences and university courses. Tyler Townsend is a registered dietitian and the Associate Manager of Nutrition and Science Communications at Heartland Food Products Group. Tyler's past experience includes surgical weight loss, as well as employer benefits consulting and health data analytics for self-funded employer groups. For fun, Tyler enjoys going to concerts, taking road trips, and spending too much time playing pickleball, at least according to his wife. And so with that, I'm pleased to turn it over to Tyler and the team. Welcome to you all.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. So we do want to start off. We've got a lot of information to cover in this this hour that we're together. So to start off with the learning objectives. So we're going to explain how low and no-calorie sweeteners are regulated in the regulation process, interpret the body of literature related to low and no-calorie sweeteners, gut health, cravings, and cancer risk, and demonstrate appropriate uses of low and no-calorie sweeteners as alternatives for added sugar. All right, so the first thing is diving into this regulation process. So when we look at the regulation process in the United States, the most important things to know are these definitions of a food additive, and you'll hear me say GRAS, or generally recognized as safe, according to the US FDA. So for a food additive, this is any substance the intended use of which results or may reasonably be expected to result directly or indirectly in its becoming a component or otherwise affecting the characteristics of any food. And then we have generally recognized as safe, which is any substance that is intentionally added to a food as a food additive that is subject to pre-market review and approval by the FDA, unless the substance is generally recognized among qualified experts as having been adequately shown to be safe under the conditions of its intended use. So when we look at this, we see that there's two pathways to be regulated, and whether that's through being generally recognized as safe or as a food additive, they're both rigorous, they're both extensive, and they're both thorough. So kind of putting the two together to make more sense. The FDA determines the safety of an ingredient, but this determination of an ingredient being generally recognized as safe can be made by qualified experts outside of the government. So it's really this review by a third party without bias, and the FDA will continue to monitor the latest science available on sweeteners, as well as reassess the science about the exposure and about the safety of a sweetener each time that a food additive or a GRAS notice for that sweetener is filed. So it's not really like this one and done review either. It continues to be updated and studied as time goes on. So you may be wondering, like, well, what determines an ingredient being approved as a food additive, and what is approval under generally recognized as safe? Which is the case for a more common sweetener that we hear about today is monk fruit being approved under generally recognized as safe. Well, for this GRAS or generally recognized as safe, it has to meet one of the following two conditions to be approved. First, it must have a history or a safe use that has been established and a significant number of people consuming the ingredient prior to the enactment of the Food and Drug Cosmetics Act of 1958. Or scientific data and information about the safety and the use of the ingredient are widely known and publicly available in scientific articles, position papers, and the like, with consensus among scientific experts that the ingredient is safe for its intended use. So either pathway requires extensive research and data that proves an ingredient to be safe for its intended use, and really brings in those experts to make that determination and having consensus as well. So I now want to transition a little bit more into the details of the approval process, which really brings into the discussion the NOAEL, or No Observed Adverse Effects level, and the ADI, which is the acceptable daily intake. So the acceptable daily intake. The ADI is the amount of an approved food additive that can be consumed daily, really with this keyword, over a lifetime without appreciable health risk. So let's take example aspartame. So if someone were to consume aspartame daily over the course of a lifetime, there is this threshold established to determine what is considered safe or without appreciable health risk. And we express the ADI in terms of milligrams per kilogram of body weight per day. And when it comes to the acceptable daily intake, it's important to consider who is involved as well. So at the international level, we have the JECFA, who is this committee of scientific experts that performs risk assessments and provides advice to the Food and Agricultural Organization and also the World Health Organization. In the United States specifically, the safety of a food additive falls under the Food and Drug Administration. So how do products obtain an ADI? Well, for these low and no calorie sweeteners to be approved, it must go through this strict pre-market safety evaluation where these authorities thoroughly review data on the chemistry, they look at the metabolism of a substance, they look at the proposed uses, the exposure assessment, and then also studies for toxicity. So this entire process is based on independent expert reviews to ensure that there's no bias. And only when there's strong evidence of no safety concern is a food additive permitted for use. And so, with that, when they're doing these studies, we see that low and no calorie sweeteners are some of the most researched ingredients in the world. And in the review process, an acceptable daily intake level is established for each of the low and no calorie sweeteners, and the ADI is established based on the daily maximum intake that can be given, again, throughout the life without adverse effects, which is known as the No Observed Adverse Effect level, or the NOAEL. So the NOAEL is established, and even at that level too, as the name applies, there's no adverse effects, but to ensure safety, we take the NOAEL, we divide it by 100 as a safety factor, and that's how we come up with the acceptable daily intake level. And the ADI is inclusive of that safety factor. So both national and regional authorities continue to track and monitor usages as well. So if we think about the estimated daily intake, the estimated daily intake doesn't even reach close to what the acceptable daily intake level is. And also remember that the ADI is relevant to lifetime use. So if we think about short-term intake, if short-term intake exceeds the ADI, it isn't a concern because, again, we're looking at lifetime use. So as long as this short-term intake above the ADI doesn't continue in the long term, it's not a concern. And kind of what I mentioned before, we typically see people that are considered high consumers to be well below what is the acceptable daily intake. And in this next slide, I'm give more of a visual of what this looks like. So looking at this visual, we see that we have this bar chart with the red bar reflecting the no observed adverse effect level. So there is no adverse health outcomes at that level of intake. We would still take that and we divide it by 100 for the safety factor to get what is considered the acceptable daily intake, or the ADI. And even though we have an ADI established, the estimated daily intake would be reflected based on someone replacing 100% of their sugar intake with a low and no calorie sweeteners, which is still uncommon to do. So the estimated daily intake is still less than the acceptable daily intake. So I put some numbers in here, for example, looking at sucralose specifically. So the NOAEL level is 2,600 packets per day. To ensure safety, we take that 2,600 packets, or the no observed adverse effect level, we divide it by 100 to get 26 packets per day, which would still be pretty difficult to do, getting 26 packets of sucralose per day. And we know with research, we see the estimated daily intake of sucralose being 8 packets per day, which is only 30% of what the acceptable daily intake level is. And again, the ADI is looking at lifetime use. So this is saying to meet the ADI, you would need to consume 26 packets per day each day of your life. So even if short-term intake goes beyond 26 packets, it isn't a concern as long as short-term intake exceeding the ADI doesn't transition into every day over the course of a lifetime. So these graphs we have here, these were adopted from the FDA. So the left graph provides a visual into the ADI of each low and no calorie sweeteners. That shows both the ADI in terms of packets per day, and then it's also expressed based on milligrams per kilogram of body weight per day. So by knowing this information, we can see that would be, more of a challenge to meet the acceptable daily intake level. I would think this is good visuals to have on hand when discussing low and no calorie sweeteners with patients or clients. And for the graph on the left too, keep in mind that you'll see stevia on there and with a little asterisk, so that's reflecting it's based on a high purity form of stevia. And you actually see monk fruit does not have an acceptable daily intake level, which means that at really high levels of intake, adverse effects were not established or found, which is why there is not an ADI established at this time. So for the graph on the left, this can be helpful when we're working with patients that maybe have questions about, how many packets can I have per day? Or how many packets is considered safe to use? So in the packets per day column, this is reflected based on someone that is 60 kilograms or 150 pounds, just as like a general guideline to make it easier if you're using this with your patients. And we also have the graph on the right, which shows the sweetness intensity compared to regular sugar too. So it's also helpful to show clients when you're talking about sweeteners and perhaps they've never used them before. Or maybe they're just used to using aspartame and they want to transition to sucralose, so they assume, well, if I use 2 packets of aspartame, I'll use 2 packets of sucralose. And then they're surprised by, the intensity of sweetness because sucralose just has a higher sweetness intensity compared to aspartame. So just good things to keep on hand when you're working with your patients and talking about sweeteners. And before we transition over to Davide's section, he's got some great insight and research about, preference and desire for sweetness and information on low no calorie sweeteners and gut health. I did just want to share some of these trusted regulatory organizations that do support the use of low and no calorie sweeteners. So, organizations like the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics have put out position papers that, state a preference for a sweet taste is innate and sweeteners can increase the pleasure of eating and consumers can safely enjoy nutritive and non-nutritive sweeteners. And organizations like the American Diabetes Association also state non-nutritive sweeteners can reduce overall calorie and carbohydrate intake as long as individuals are not compensating with additional calories from other food sources. So with that, sweeteners are some of the most thoroughly researched ingredients in the world. They have a long history of use and a history of safety because of the strict pre-market research that's been going on and that has been completed before approval. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Davide to take over his section.
Thank you, Tyler. To follow up on your last point and to introduce the scientific context around low no-calorie sweeteners, I wanted to summarize what trusted regulatory health organizations have recommended with regards of limiting free sugars intake. And just to remind everyone, what free sugars are all monosaccharides and disaccharides that they're added to foods by not only the manufacturer, but also by us in our everyday life, plus the sugars that they're naturally present in honey, syrups, and then fruit juices. So the global recommendations are that a reduction in the intake of these free sugars is to be less than 10% of total energy intake. to achieve benefits, health benefits like improved body weight control, prevention of overweight and obesity, and chronic non-communicable diseases like type 2 diabetes and dental cavities. There's also an additional recommendation for additional health benefits, which is the reduction in the intake of free sugars to less than 5% of total energy intake. While that is known, there is also some apparent concern around the role of sweetness, because some authoritative bodies have recommended not only to reduce free sugar consumption, but also to reduce the consumption of sweet tasting foods and beverages, and that is regardless of the source of the sweet taste. So either from caloric or from low no calorie sweeteners. And these recommendations really arise from the widespread assumption that an increased exposure to sweet tasting foods and beverages might lead to an increased preference for sweet taste and increased intakes of sweet foods and perhaps also free sugars. And that's what is known as a sweet tooth effect. So although this hypothesis is often stated as a fact in the literature and even in some public health policies, evidence from multiple studies actually do not confirm that sweetness exposure drives sweet tooth. And in particular, I wanted to show a very recent paper of our group that is a narrative review with the aim of providing an updated review of all the published evidence that examines this very topic of the sweet tooth. And the reason why we did it was that because the last one that was performed on this topic was in 2017, and since then many studies on sweet tooth have been published. So what did we find? We found, and most of our findings agree with previous evidence. So the first finding was that sweetness exposure actually does not promote the sweet tooth in both adults and children. But actually, in the contrary, at least in the short term, sweet food consumption tends to reduce the desire for sweet foods. So that's something known as a sensory-specific satiety. In addition, early exposure to sweet foods and drinks in infancy and adolescence does not increase the preference for sweet tastes later in life. And the bottom line is that how much people like sweet taste is very, very individualized. So although we're all attracted naturally, almost evolutionary, to sweet taste, there is a lot of biological variation. While some people might like a lot sweetness, others might not like it that much. And to further stress how this is a hot topic, in our paper we also show how a couple of big clinical trials are actually ongoing on this topic that I'm showing in this slide, and in particular this one called the Sweet Tooth Study, that is a randomized controlled trial looking into the effect of different sweetness exposure. So we have low, regular, and high, and then further preference for sweet foods and beverages, and to compare these effects between the intervention groups. So while we're just seeing that the sweet tooth effect is not actually substantiated by the actual evidence, we can see how low no-calorie sweeteners can actually have a role in a sweet, healthy diet, because they can help individuals to meet the previously shown added sugar reduction recommendations while still enjoying sweet taste. Because no consistent evidence has actually shown that low no-calorie sweeteners stimulate appetite or the sweet tooth, but on the contrary, a substantial amount of studies have shown that low no-calorie sweeteners can actually help in reducing calorie intake, assist with modest weight loss, and do not affect glycemia, lipidemia, and blood pressure, and can actually cause a lower rise in blood glucose levels when used instead of sugar. But what about the gut microbiota, which is the collection of bacteria and other organisms that are colonizing our gut? I'm asking this question because I'm sure most of you have seen many headlines that claim or at least warn against the use of low no-calorie sweeteners because of their supposed negative effect on the gut microbiota. So is this true? So before answering that question, I wanted to provide a quick reminder of the kind of nutritional research that exists, but keeping in mind that for now, often these headlines refer to studies that they are performed in animals, so not humans, and or in vitro, so in laboratory settings at much higher quantities that they are normally found in products. And another thing that I wanted to point out is that, as you can see, many of these headlines actually refer to low no-calorie sweeteners as a homogeneous group gathered under the same artificial sweetener label. So what kind of nutritional research is out there, and what is the hierarchy of evidence? Is simply a method that is used, applied to assess the quality of the available scientific evidence. And this comes very handy and helpful when comparing different study designs or different studies out there and to assess their reliability. And it's frequently shown in the form of a pyramid. So the higher you go, the higher the quality of the study and or the evidence. So on the top, we have systematic reviews and meta-analysis that they are collection of many different studies that they are analyzed in a statistical view, so that to provide results and assessments that they are not just based on a single study, but an entire collection of studies on a single topic. But we also have randomized clinical trials that are able to provide very reliable evidence because they're able to control for many different variables. While at the bottom, you see that we have editorials and expert opinions that by definitions are very subjective, but also animal studies and in vitro studies that they're performed in laboratories, and they're difficult to translate to actual human situations. Another important topic that is very good to consider when assessing the reliability of studies is the correlation versus causation topic. Because when we talk about correlation, we are talking of two or more variables that are considered to be related, as one value of one variable increases or decreases, so does the value of the other variable. The problem with correlations between variables is that it does not automatically mean that the change in one variable is then connected or is the cause of the change in the other variable. And to stress this point, I've put this little graph on the right where the author of this important paper compared chocolate consumption expressed by kilograms per year per capita and Nobel laureates in different kind of countries. And you see that the more chocolate people consume, the more it appears that Nobel laureates are in a particular country. So is the solution to become smarter, to eat more chocolate? I wish. So here comes the causation that actually indicates that one event is the result of the occurrence of the other event. And to really establish causation from correlation, you need to take into account many different variables that could be confounding factors, so that could skew that correlation. So for that reason, studies like randomized clinical trials are very high on the pyramid of the quality of the evidence, because they're able to rule out all these possible confounding variables and actually prove causation rather than just correlation. With this in mind, let me go back to the question I asked a couple of slides ago. So are low no-calorie sweeteners harmful for the gut microbiota? In one of our recent studies, we tried to actually address this question by collaborating with a company called Cryptobiotics that is specializes in gut microbiota studies using a particular technology that is able not only to simulate the entire human digestion process, so from the moment people ingest an ingredient or a food product to the very moment until they excrete it, but they're also able to provide reliable results that have been validated with actual human data. So this is still a laboratory study, but it uses a technology that has been shown to provide very reliable results in actual human studies. And we used this approach to study the effect of different low no-calorie sweetener types, such as rare sugars like tagatose, sugar alcohols like sorbitol and maltitol, but also high-intensity sweeteners like stevia and sucrose, in both healthy individuals, but also type 2 diabetes. And this is one of the very few studies to also address the type 2 diabetic population, even though this population is the population that actually might be using low no-calorie sweeteners to reduce the amount of free sugar in their diet while keeping the sweetness. So what did we find with this study? What we found was that not all sweeteners are the same. And what I mean by that is that each single sweetener that we tested either had no impact on the gut microbiota, such as sucralose, or it did have an impact, but the impact was very different. For example, stevia stimulated the growth of some potentially beneficial bacteria, while sorbitol, for instance, stimulated the growth of very different bacteria. So the first difference is the taxonomic shift in the bacterial population that different low no-calorie sweeteners affect, but also the fermentation speed. So different kind of sweeteners had their effect on the gut microbiota in different times. So some, they were very quick to be used by the gut microbiota, and others, they took a little bit longer. And also the effect on healthy or type 2 diabetics was different sometimes. What we also found, perhaps surprisingly for some, is that some of the sweeteners that we tested, like stevia, had actually a beneficial impact on the gut microbiota. And this happened by increasing certain health-supporting bacteria with the production of short-chain fatty acids. They are known to be beneficial for human physiology, and that they're usually associated with things like prebiotic ingredients like fibers. So all in all, low no-calorie sweeteners could actually offer potential health benefits beyond their established sugar and calorie reduction benefits, and while not hurting the gut microbiota, but actually potentially being beneficial instead. So in brief, before leaving the stage to Nicole, I wanted to leave you with some key takeaways. Regarding sweetness, we saw how low no-calorie sweeteners can be a part of a healthy sweet diet, helping with calorie reduction and free sugar reduction when used to replace sugar, helping to add some sweetness to the diet. And the available scientific evidence does not support the widespread assumption of a sweet tooth, but on the contrary, at least in the short term, sensor-specific satiety might occur. And talking about low no-calorie sweeteners and microbiota, we saw how different low no-calorie sweeteners affected the gut microbiota in a highly specific manner. So not all sweeteners are the same. So it's not correct to refer to them as a single label, with a single label like artificial sweeteners. It could have even more benefits than previously thought, at least on the gut microbiota. So we saw no indication of a negative impact on the gut microbiota.
Hey there, thank you, Davide. Hi guys, Nicole here. Let's talk all about low and no calorie sweeteners and cancer risk. As a cancer dietitian, this is something I talk about a lot, and I'm just excited to talk with you how to navigate and support your patients through this as well. So first off, let's just dive right in, start through some of the studies and what they were looking at to show that low and no calorie sweeteners do not increase cancer risk at all. Certain analyses, they had failed to show any associations between low calorie sweeteners use and cancer mortality. And actually in some of these reviews where they were showing, like they were looking at, hey, what's the safety of low and no calorie sweeteners? They were looking at the chemical properties and stability, how the body processes it in animals and humans. I mean, these studies were very, very complete. They were looking at potential for genetic damage with low and no calorie sweeteners and cancer risk. They were looking at animal and human growth for cancer risk. Basically, they were looking at estimated daily intakes in these studies throughout the decades of, different groups, even with people with special dietary needs and low and no calorie sweeteners, and it's, whether or not it's increasing cancer risk. And they continue to conclude that different low and no calorie sweeteners and like sucralose right here in this study, that there's no present carcinogenic hazard to humans. So they were really looking at everything. And I think that's what's so important and key about low and no calorie sweeteners and cancer risk is they continue to look at this all the time. And they look at it in so many different ways and so many different components and individuals in these studies. And that is really great news. It's not just like studied once, it's studied all the time. And that's so important for us to remember as dietitians and also to share to our clients. Okay, researchers, they have conducted studies on the safety of artificial sweeteners. They found no evidence of sweeteners causing cancer in humans. Another study in 2005 actually questioned if aspartame could cause lymphoma or leukemia in rats. And it's key here, guys, when you are, when your clients or patients are presenting to you information or you're looking through these studies, when they're looking at rats or animals and, lab bios, this is not going to be the same as humans. And most often what I'll find, and you may find this as well, is that your patients are bringing to you these very weak studies. These very weak studies that, maybe are from a long time ago and have scared them, and we need to continue to point them in the direction that, hey, okay, for example, the study from 2005, the National Toxicology Program, they went ahead and they did further research on it, showed that aspartame, does not cause tumors, even though in 2005, that one, study had questioned about aspartame. And then previous thought that aspartame may increase risk of some cancers has continued to be disproven, again, using different measures, different individuals, different chemical evidence, or looking at chemical properties of these different low and no calorie sweeteners. So a few things to remember to keep in mind is, when were these studies come out? And who, and like, for example, talking about the National Toxicology Program, and then, we're going to talk later about IARC and things like that, but just continuing to look at like, hey, okay, if there's a question, for increasing cancer risk, what are they doing about it? And they continue to research and show that it does not increase cancer risk, which is so important to help everyone feel at ease, all your patients feel at ease. The American Cancer Society had shared that there is no clear evidence that these low and no calorie sweeteners at the levels typically consumed in humans cause cancer. All right, so typical levels, I know everyone's different. Typically, people are going to have, if they have like diet sodas, for example, typically they'll have 2 a day. We know there's people out there that are having 8 a day. It's still way below the adequate daily intake. But on average, most people, when you're talking to them, they may have up to 2 diet sodas today, or they may, add anywhere from, 1 to 3 packets per beverage 3 times a day. So maybe they'll have, 3 to 9 packets a day. That is on average. So when the American Cancer Society says, hey, those typical levels are safe, that's usually that's what they're talking about. And again, please note, like Tyler was mentioning, it's way below the adequate daily intake, in which that is also way below the safe level of intake. Those levels are very, very low. Questions about artificial sweeteners and cancer risk had arose when early studies showed that saccharin caused bladder cancer in lab animals. Again, with the laboratory animal studies, but studies in humans have demonstrated no increase in cancer risk. So all of the sweeteners appear to be safe when consumed in moderation. And again, the adequate daily intake is actually pretty high level that most people are not consuming for these sweeteners. All right, so let's talk about this IARC. So IARC is the International Agency Research on Cancer. What they went ahead and did, it was back in July 14th in 2023. IARC had released the aspartame hazard and risk assessment results. IARC listed aspartame as a possible carcinogenic for humans, which falls into group 2B. We're going to talk a little bit more about that next. Okay, so group 2B is given on the basis of limited evidence for cancer in humans, and that's so important. Most individuals, in fact, I was literally asked this by someone like 3 days ago, I'm not even kidding. They see carcinogen, that word next to a food or an ingredient, and they don't understand, they're seeing red now, they don't really realize how to break things down, and so that's what we're going to do for them. So group 2B is not going to be considered group A. As you can see here shown, IARC classified aspartame as possible carcinogenic, which means it's based on limited evidence for cancer. Limited evidence, not concrete, it's not increasing cancer risk. IARC also did mention this as well. IARC is not trying to scare anyone. They are not trying to hide any information. It was just, people get confused by this information when they read it, and as dietitians, we can help to clarify. Both evaluations noted limited in the available evidence for cancer and other health effects when it came to aspartame, and the strength of evidence classification in group 2B. So we want to really make sure we're looking at carcinogens related to which group IARC is listing off, right? It's generally used either when there's limited but not convincing evidence. So limited, not convincing evidence. And that's really what we're looking for when it comes to foods that are increasing cancer risk, or low and no calorie sweeteners increasing cancer risk. We want clear evidence, but there is not. It's limited, it's not convincing, and that continues to be the result. So back in July, when they shared this information, it should have been good news. Hey guys, guess what? We looked at it again, it's still safe. But unfortunately, so many people, media and things twisted that as being like, whoa, aspartame, that word is anywhere near a carcinogen, and they blew it up. And all they were doing is just reaffirming, hey guys, this is still safe, which is really great news. Now let's look at how the IARC does the classification. So looking at IARCs and how they list out carcinogens. Okay, you see there's group 1, there's group 2A, there's group 2B, and there's group 3. Group 3, is it not classifiable as it's a carcinogen to humans? It's just not. Group 1, it is. It is a carcinogen. All right, alcoholic beverages, guys. Let's be talking to our patients about that. And it's interesting because you probably find this a lot, especially when it comes to low and no calorie sweeteners. People are really quick to judge or cause concern or question these very safe low and no calorie sweeteners, but they're drinking alcohol, and that is a group 1, okay, which it absolutely does increase risk of 6 different cancers. Now you'll look at group 2A and group 2B. These are probably or possibly, all right? So possibly group 2B is where aspartame had fell. It is not group A, it is not alcohol, which is definitely increasing cancer risk at any consumption. There is not sufficient evidence that it increases risk for cancer. So group 2A, 2B, and group 3 do not increase risk for any cancer, and aspartame is in there. Again, it just comes back to a lot of people not understanding, but that's why we're here to learn and understand so we can share this information to our amazing patients who need us. Okay, so these are reading beyond the headlines, questions you've probably heard, and then how to address them with your clients, how to address them with your patients. And these are like, one sentence. So definitely use these. So for example, someone comes to you and they're like, hey, does low or no calorie sweeteners cause cancer? And you will respond, there is no convincing evidence that using or avoiding those low or no calorie sweeteners that they can adversely impact cancer development or its responsiveness to cancer treatment. So that's important too. Some people with a history, or they have cancer, they're in treatment, and they're like, oh my gosh, can I have these? Are they safe? And you let them know they are very safe. If this is what they want to use to enjoy their sweetness, they absolutely can. It will not increase their cancer risk. There's not going to be any more worse reoccurrence because of it, and it will not interrupt their treatment. Another question is, hey, IARC said aspartame is a possible carcinogen. Should I stop using it? Which you probably will be asked because July was not that long ago. And then you just say, hey, no IARC recommendation related to aspartame intake limits have not changed, which is true. They just reaffirm the adequate daily intake. They reaffirm that it's safe. And also, it's really nice to see that we're continuing to study these food ingredients and make sure they're safe. I mean, this is good news. Research proves aspartame continues to be a safe sweetener. Another question is, hey, do low and no calorie sweeteners negatively impact health, leading to cancer in the GI, so gut cancers. Okay, and then you just let them know, hey, guess what? The research, the new research, up-to-date research, which I think is really important, because when they're pulling this information or studies from so many years ago, we want to know, hey, what's up to date? So share that with your clients. Hey, guess what? The up-to-date research is saying and solidifying that the previous data that low and no calorie sweeteners does not negatively impact the gut microbiome or cause any gut cancers. Because people they'll make that connection, and you just got to reassure them, like, listen, it's still safe. It's not causing any of those GI cancers. So now let's talk about my favorite topic is lifestyle changes to prevent cancer. So now that you've talked with your clients or patients about how low and no calorie sweeteners are safe, okay, we've got that out of the way. They're feeling better. Now you can empower them with what is the strong human data, current and up-to-date ways to reduce cancer risk. These are the things that we want to be talking about. Depending on, the setting that you have and how much you have with your client or patient, you can figure out how much information you want to give with them or follow up with this information. But exercising 150 minutes of moderate physical activity or 75 minutes of vigorous physical activity each week will reduce their risk of multiple cancers. So we'll start there. Plant-based diets, this does not mean that anyone has to go vegan or vegetarian. What it means is if you want to reduce cancer risk, you want to add in more plant foods. The majority of your plate, like let's say, tell them two-thirds of your plate, let's have more plant foods, those fruits, those veggies, those nuts, seeds, beans, legumes, all of those plant foods. Again, it does not mean that they have to omit all the meats and dairy and eggs. The only thing they want to do is eliminate alcohol and processed meats. Processed meats are going to be how the World Cancer Research defines processed meat, because, everything can be considered processed these days, right? So processed meats is defined as any food that's been salted, cured, pre-cooked, things like that to preserve it. So we're not talking about the raw meats in this store. We're talking about the pre-cooked meats, the sausages, bacon, ham. Those pre-cooked meats are defined as processed meats and can increase risk of colorectal cancer. All right, so that's what they need to be focusing on. These low and no calorie sweeteners do not increase risk of colon cancer. No, but we know for sure, shared and supported by the World Cancer Research Fund, processed meats do. So does alcohol. So we want to get their focus back on that. And then reducing sugary beverages, that's not because of the sugar directly, it's because sugary beverages have a lot of calories. Just easily, you go get Starbucks or your favorite coffee spot, you got 800 calorie medium drink, okay? Not saying that's bad, but we all know if there's going to be an excess of calories that could potentially lead to weight gain, excess fat tissue, that will then increase your risk of 13 different cancers. Fiber focus, 30 grams a day, that's going to come from your plant food, so will come from, more of that plant-based diet. Always eliminating smoking and tobacco, that's pretty well known. The alcohol and processed meats is not as well known. And then adipose tissue, it's just that excess fat tissue on your body. So it's not really coming down to so much how much someone weighs, it's coming down to that fat tissue level. So working with your clients and patients on lowering fat tissue, not necessarily the number on the scale, but that fat tissue. Okay, and then key takeaways. All right, so just in summary, for you to take back to all your patients and clients, low and no calorie sweeteners are put through rigorous approval process and only approved when there is evidence of no safety concerns. And they have done such an amazing job of this, and I think this is we really want to emphasize, is we as researchers are taking such good care of looking at the safety of them, and they continue to show that. Okay, and we want to continue to talk with people about that when it comes to cancer risk, because there are a lot of people afraid to eat a lot of different things, and we don't need low and no calorie sweeteners to be one of them. There's no indication of a negative impact of low and no calorie sweeteners on the gut microbiota, and the available scientific evidence does not support the widespread assumption of sweet tooth. And then lastly, low and no calorie sweeteners do not cause cancer or negatively impact a person with a cancer diagnosis. All right, thank you guys so much.
Awesome. Well, we're going to move on to the Q&A. We actually have a ton of really good questions in here too. So thank you guys for sticking around for that. The first one that I thought was interesting, Davide, I'll have you take this one first. So there's a question that asks, why are we so attracted to the taste of sweetness, and why do we typically dislike bitterness? So is that something you could provide more information on?
Yeah, it's basically an evolutionary adaptation. Sweetness from a biological evolutionary standpoint signals the presence of calories or energy in general. So that's something that in our evolutionary path we needed to be attracted to, because there wasn't many calories out there. So something that we were attracted to. So that's almost hardwired. So we are naturally attracted to sweetness for that reason. Sugars, for example, are sweet and they are easy, fast calories. On the opposite, we have bitterness that usually it's people don't like it, and again, it's an evolutionary adaptation. We usually find bitter compounds in plants, and it's a system of the plant to protect themselves. So of course that's supposed to not be liked by predators. So that's the main reason, although at very low amounts, bitter compounds could be actually very beneficial for our health, for instance, like polyphenols. But in larger quantities, they might signal toxicity or potential danger, so that's why we don't usually like it.
Awesome, yeah, thank you for that. And then, Nicole, there's a question here that I think you'd be best to answer this one. So I guess kind of more along the lines of personal experiences with sweeteners, I would say. So how do you explain that when people say like, oh, you know, I tried this sweetener and, you know, I got a headache from it, or some sort of like kind of like individual preference? Like, is there like an explanation for those types of things? Like when it comes to, you know, perhaps like someone getting a headache when they consume sweeteners?
Yeah, so that's a comment. I'll hear that a lot. So there's so many different reasons of why they're getting a headache. I mean, looking at just some people may react to other, you know, certain food additives or ingredients. Maybe they will have a food sensitivity to a certain artificial sweetener. It may have nothing to do with that artificial sweetener, or you know, it was from a different food sensitivity, or they were dehydrated, or a different health issue that's going on. So I think that people are quick to jump and blame the artificial sweetener just because that's been something that, you know, people have shared that they have experienced, but there's no proof that, hey, that came from those artificial sweeteners. It's just like a common way people try to, when people have maybe an agenda of, you know, talking about how low and no calorie sweeteners are causing, you know, physical side effects, they always want to say it's the headache, and then people get a headache and they're just going to automatically attribute it to that. But it's not actually the artificial sweetener. There's something else going on, or it's a possible food sensitivity. It's not any danger from those actual sweeteners.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And there was a question here too. So it's a little bit more of a common theme question too. So are sweeteners that are considered generally recognized as safe, you know, things like monk fruit, versus ones that are approved as an additive, you know, is one safer than the other? And the answer to that really is just no. I mean, so they're both processes when they're doing the approval process for sweeteners, and you know, with the very strict pre-market safety evaluation going on. One is not like necessarily like an easier process to be approved than another. So you know, both pathways, they're rigorous and thorough and extensive. That you know, one is not considered to be more safe than the other. So thank you for that question too. And then another question for Davide here. So in the presentation, it was mentioned that sucralose did not affect the gut microbiota. And then in your presentation too, you mentioned that stevia has a beneficial impact on the gut microbiota. So I guess is to kind of like water down the question, like, is that good news or bad news? Like when we're talking about sweeteners and one has no effect, is no effect a good thing or a bad thing? So could you shed some more light on that?
Yeah, sure. I would say that overall, compared to those headlines we have seen, even no effect is better than negative effect. But to give a more a pragmatic answer. In the specific case of sucralose, it is actually good news because previous animal studies have hypothesized that sucralose could have a negative effect on rats, on the gut microbiota of rats. Of course, rats are not humans, and a study of the gut microbiota and the effect of sucralose on the gut microbiota of humans was still missing. So we were not able to replicate those results. And in our study that, again, used actual human samples with a technology that has been able to replicate actual results in human studies, we did not see any kind of effect on the gut microbiota. So I would call it good news in the case of sucralose.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And we did have, let's see here, a couple questions kind of talking about sweeteners and stroke or heart attack or, I guess, negative cardiovascular events, or cardiovascular disease. So there was a study, I think it was early 2023, that kind of linked erythritol to cardiovascular disease risk. And so there was a couple of things with that study when it came out. So it included people that were already at an increased risk for cardiovascular disease events, and it didn't narrow in on dietary erythritol as the causal agent for it, because they didn't like collect food recalls. They didn't specifically look at dietary erythritol intake. And actually, so your body naturally produces erythritol, and the people in the study had naturally elevated levels of erythritol. And when we look at dietary erythritol, it's approved for use in more than 60 countries. And in the regulation process, because it's so strict, the safety of it has been substantiated in these studies, and it's approved for use around the world. So it didn't, kind of like I said, it didn't narrow in on dietary erythritol. It used people that were already at an increased risk for cardiovascular disease. So it didn't necessarily look at how dietary erythritol impacts cardiovascular disease. So thank you for that question too. There was some about the acceptable daily intake level and its application to kids. I think kids was a common one. So the acceptable daily intake level, that is applicable to everyone. So it's applicable to adults, to kids, to women who are pregnant. It's kind of like established as that safety factor for all those types of populations. It's not like just applicable to healthy adults. It's applicable to everyone. Some information here just about, when we're looking at sweeteners, like we really see we see the benefit when you replace sweeteners for whether they be sugary drinks or things of that nature. So there's like just a couple good points in there about the benefit is switching to sweeteners. That way you reduce your intake of added sugar to improve the quality of your diet and better help manage blood glucose levels and reduce caloric intake. So definitely some good points in there too. I guess there were some other questions about I guess sweetness and cravings. So Davide, this might be a good question for you. So how does sensory specific satiety occur, and when could people expect this to happen? I guess, do you have a good answer for that one?
I hope it's good, but I do have an answer to that one. So most studies have shown such effect in the short term, and by short term we mean less than a month intervention study, and that's why in my slides I also showed a couple of examples of ongoing longer clinicals, because that's where the evidence is actually missing. But at least in the short term, we did see sensory specific effects, and how that occurs, it appears that if you're exposed to high sweetness levels in the short term, then the repercussion of that is that you end up potentially to eat or not seeking any more sweet products after that. It's almost like your taste buds were overwhelmed by that sweetness, so you don't want to eat any more sweet things. This is a kind of a simplistic way to look at it, but that's how generally sensory-specific satiety is looked at.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Nicole, this would be a good question for you too. So I feel like when we're working with patients and clients, maybe more so in your specific practice too, like I feel like there's definitely just a lot of like controversy and questions around low and no calorie sweeteners and cancer risk. So do you have any insight like why are sweeteners have so much controversy in that space?
Honestly, it's a lot of the influencers and just a lot of biased people out there. So like, what I'm seeing all the time is people want to, there's a lot of opinions of major influencers, media, who say, low and no calorie sweeteners are toxic. They're not natural, whatever their agenda is. And millions of people are being exposed to this all the time. In fact, when IARC and re-releasing the ADI last of July is a great example of that. That was absolutely massive. It was on social media everywhere, articles, all of it, saying, hey, look, we told you, so people have a certain agenda. They're not looking at science. Usually people who are not registered dietitians, they are not researchers. They do not share up-to-date fact-based information, and they are massive influencers to millions of people. And they are talking bad about low and no-calorie sweeteners, diet sodas, whatever it is, all the time. And so we are, and then people come to us, and we're trying to explain the science. We want to make sure we're doing a really good job of explaining it very simply, because these people, these influencers who are sharing lies are pretty darn convincing, and it's just their own agenda. Us as registered dietitians, we're here to share the facts. People can have these or not. We don't really mind. It's just whatever people prefer. But these other people have an agenda, and so they continue to talk bad about and you'll see it all the time. So what we're doing, what we want to do is understand that maybe we're really well versed at reading the studies, and we can pick up on how to read people or studies really quick. General population can't. So unfortunately, they're going to come to you with these questions. Always. We're never going to get rid of this. So we just need to continue to look at the up-to-date evidence like you guys are doing today, and then just keep sharing it, because unfortunately they're going to be hearing these myths from influencers for a long time, because the influencers just have an agenda of how they don't like diet soda or Splenda or whatever, aspartame, all those different things. So we need to make sure to just come back with the facts and be patient with them as we teach them.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks for that answer. And we probably have time for one more question here coming up on the top of the hour. There was a couple questions about effects of sweetener intake and effects on insulin. So when we're going back to Davide's section too about the hierarchy of evidence. So in these systematic reviews and meta-analyses that have these randomized controlled trials, like the totality of evidence is that doesn't support that insulin changes because of sweetener intake too. So definitely encourage, like when you're looking at studies, like look at that top of the pyramid to find those effects or what the research says too. And then just a couple questions about when you have a sweetener and you're looking at the packaging, there's some other ingredients, like when you're looking at sucralose, like it's not just sucralose in there. So they use a bulking agent in there too, because let's say you were to open a packet of stevia or open a packet of sucralose and you were to empty it out, you would honestly probably feel like you got ripped off, because not much would come out of that packet. So those bulking products or agents that they use in it, it's really to help it easier to measure when you compare it to sugar too. So just wanted to kind of talk about that too. And I believe our time is up now, so I'll turn it over.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tyler, Davide, and Nicole. There was a lot of excitement about today's presentation, and I want to thank each of you for sharing your expertise on this important topic. And with that, we've come to the end of our webinar. Your attendance certificates are now available to download. You can follow the instructions on the screen or refer to the final slide of the presentation handout for more information on how to complete the webinar evaluation and access your certificate. The credit claiming email will be sent out within the next 24 hours, likely within the next few hours. The presentation handouts were emailed to you earlier today. Several of you mentioned that you didn't receive those. The links will be available in the credit claiming email for you to re-download those handouts once those are sent out. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Nicole, Davide, and Tyler for sharing your expertise. And I wish everyone a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week.